by far the biggest accomplishment that Canada has made on the world stage as a nation is somehow convincing everyone that it is not worse than or on par with the United States. Because arguably, you could say it's just as bad as the US, albeit in different ways at times, but mostly the same ways. Or you could argue that it's even worse. The fact that the Canadian health system, for one, is basically non-functional, that they had hundreds more hospitals available to the people when it was initialized than they do now, that they've actively closed facilities and have not adequately funded medical care, is one way in which you can critique that country as an unattractive place to go. Now, of course, the answer is not public funding of private hospitals, because that inevitably leads to the kind of situation that Canada's in, where both parties support some form of austerity that is selling the people out, that is causing the medical system to not be able to support the people it's meant to support. Well, the actual answer is a very expensive national healthcare system that's adequately funded. One that is completely removed from the claws of private industry, where things like patents on medicine even are not able to be made. So you get rid of intellectual property even on medicine, in addition to nationalizing the medical system. And you fund, you instead of doing the opposite. They're in crisis over there as far as healthcare is concerned. I have one friend who has been on a waiting list to get a psychiatrist for like 3 years. And the only reason he hasn't killed himself is because guns are not widely available. And it's a good thing that guns are not widely available. I support that. I think that kind of common sense legislation should be in place in the US. And that is one area where you can say they actually are better. But at the same time, if we're talking about strictly within the realm of the medical system, the parameters of the medical system, it's not that much of a dub to have it be free for everybody, but you have to be on a waiting list for 6 months to receive significant care. You have to be on a waiting list for years to receive mental health care. That's putting a lot of people at risk. But that's the one area in which they can say, okay, we have a dub over the US. Another one would be like minor drug policy reform and some policing reform, labor laws, a right to collective bargaining. I think that's a great thing. The problem is that barely anyone seems to actually use it in the country. And the laws surrounding guns, I think these things are great things that the country does. But if you look at the infrastructure in the country, the major cities, and if you compare them to the best cities in the US, there's no competition. The best US cities, the ones where the majority of people take public transit to go to work or to go to anything, they vastly outclass every Canadian city, because there is not an innate assumption that the car will be the dominant way in which people get around. Whereas even in the somewhat better cities in Canada, like Vancouver or Toronto, even in those like shining examples of what a city can be in that loathsome hump of a country, they still fuck it up, because there are massive swaths of car-dependent nothing that act as an eyesore on the nation. And it doesn't make any sense that they're there, because when it gets that cold out, you would think that your car would stop running, or that it would become dangerous to drive on the highway because of ice. So why would you center all the infrastructure around an automobile? It doesn't make any sense. Why would you not center it around something like passenger rail? I think as well, if you look at the country's history with matters such as race, they have done a very good job at promoting a sort of ahistorical dream world to the international community, that they're this tolerant, open society devoid of discrimination and all those bad things, and they'll go on an apology tour for everything they did in the 1800s, but they won't do that same thing for all of the Jews that they refused to let into their country when they were fleeing the Holocaust. And what did they do? Instead of taking those Jewish refugees, many of whom did end up settling in the United States, what did they do instead of taking those Jewish refugees? They had one of the most militant and active fascist movements, political movements, in North America at the time, besides the one in Mexico. They also happened to harbor thousands of war criminals in the wake of the Second World War from Eastern Europe. People from the Waffen-SS, people from the Wehrmacht. These were people who committed crimes against humanity, who were involved directly in the orchestration of the Holocaust in Eastern Europe. And they said, come on in, the door's wide open. They didn't do that with Jews, but they did that with all of these Nazi war criminals who weren't particularly smart. Like, at least the Nazis that we took in the United States did things like build the space program or improve modern medicine. They also did other terrible things like Operation Gladio and Condor. But aside from their involvement in horrible, adventurous foreign policy, primarily what the Nazis we took in did was advance the sciences and bring us to the moon. And the Nazis that they took in were just like these random Eastern European murderers, and they said to them, here's a house, go have a place to live. This is why Canada remains to be the country, the single country in the world with the most monuments to the Nazi collaborator Stepan Bandera, the Ukrainian Nazi collaborator Stepan Bandera. They have the most monuments erected in the world dedicated to him. And this goes unnoticed by the international community. This goes unnoticed by historians. This goes unnoticed by everybody. These things that should be clear blights on the reputation of a nation that likes to purport itself to be nice and caring and empathic, they go unnoticed. And I believe the reason they go unnoticed is because there's a bigger boy in the room that happens to be committing atrocities, that has a history of committing atrocities, in a much louder way. Now, the United States has been committing atrocities of a similar kind, or doing bad things of a similar kind, throughout its history. But it's done so with more power on the world stage, and it's done so in a way that's louder and more egregious. Now, forgive me, I'm sick. And so what happened is people around the world turned a blind eye to Canada when they would do the exact same thing, or at times worse things, and they would, I think, correctly criticize America for the things they were doing in regard to ethnic tension, discrimination, and so on. I think in just about every sense, Canada is just worse America. And if you're from there and know your own history, then you're either going to come away with the opinion that it's worse America, or that they're like basically the same. Morally, they're basically the same. That they've participated in a lot of the same adventurism, that they've participated in a lot of the same discrimination, that they've participated in the harboring of terrible people who had deserved to be tried for their crimes and hung. These things were commonalities that the country shared. I believe in some aspects, particularly towards the Jewish people, Canada was worse. But they're very similar nations in terms of the atrocities that they've committed. And the same can be said of the First Nations people and how they were treated. The fact that to this day, First Nations people are the only people in the entirety of the country without access to proper water, that there is lead in the pipes that goes to their reservation. The government promised to fix it, and they haven't. Why is that? I believe it's a legacy of a historical, systematic inequality that exists in that country. The reason why First Nations people are disproportionately represented in suicides and mental illness, abusing drugs, violent crime, in jails, the reason why they're disproportionately represented is because after their land was quote-unquote bought from them for pennies on a dollar, they were subjugated to a second-class role in society. In some ways, it wasn't as bad as the Indians in the United States, but in many ways, it was just as bad. And that is why, to this day, you have this economic inequality and social inequality between those people and the white settlers who came there and stole the land. They may have said that they bought it, but in actuality, they stole it. There's a dark history there. There's a lot of just very dark things going on there. And all of it is overlooked because there is a much more powerful country right next door to itself that is doing horrible, adventurous things all around the world. But I don't think that's a reason to overlook the atrocities of Canada, and in some ways the even worse atrocities that the country has committed to certain people. The certain people that it's harbored that are even worse. I don't think that's a reason to overlook the fact that by any objective metric that I can think of, the infrastructure is worse. You have car-dependent cities in every major city. You have terrible public transit options, anemic public transit options that are completely non-functional. There is not a single bikeable city in that entire country. There are bikeable cities, not very many, it's like 2, but there are bikeable cities in the US. There's not anything. They have no culture. They have no real contribution to the world. Like, they're just kind of there, taking a bunch of other people's people, and at the same time driving up the cost of their own real estate because of their archaic land use restrictions that prevent multi-use developments from being made, that prevent the kind of infrastructure that works wonderfully across Europe from being made. And what you're left with is this car-dependent tundra where you're lucky if your car even starts in the morning, and a whole lot of Nazis, but you can't call them that because they're just Eastern European. It's fucking weird, dude. I mean, they do a few things better, I give them credit on that, but it's a weird place, and I wouldn't want to live there because it seems like it's just more of the same. If I were wanting to live somewhere that is different from the US, which is riddled with problems as I've pointed out over and over, I would want to go somewhere that's actually better, not somewhere that just does a good job at putting lipstick on a pig. That nation is one big, fat, ugly pig, and they can put lipstick all over its face, but that doesn't change the fact that that is a hog of a nation.